So we are here with Chris Van Nostrand for District 65 School Board, and we are going to run through a few key topics. But to jump right in, obviously the big theme of this particular election cycle is District 65's budget struggles. The current board just voted last week to approve a $13.3 million reduction for next year, which includes cutting 73 positions, 73 people from the staff overall. So when you look at that plan that was approved, what are your initial reactions? What are your concerns? And would you have done anything differently?
I think it's a solid plan. I do think that plan effectively represents the feedback that was shared certainly in a lot of the earlier meetings that I attended, which was a desire to protect as much of the core academic mission as possible within D65. So the focus on maintaining the classroom experience, on maintaining teaching levels, and maintaining as many enrichment programs as possible. So I do think that, while obviously incredibly painful, I think that shrinking the size of the central administration staff does make good economic sense, and it does reflect the wishes of the community, certainly within a lot of the forums that I attended.
And one of the things, obviously, is that this is just the beginning of this process. We're kind of transitioning into an even more difficult conversation around school closures. So, first of all, do you think we need to close schools at all?
I think it's going to be very likely. I think it's hard to envision a scenario in which school closures are not part of the process, and that's very much been teed up for phase 2 of the budget reduction planning process. So we're through phase 1. I do think we have some good momentum for that. I think good work was done as far as evaluating the overall cost structure within the district, but I think that clearly we need to think about our physical footprint and become more efficient in terms of the number of students that we have and the number of buildings that we have. Right now, our enrollments just don't support the number of facilities that we have. And there's an additional issue, of course, with the cost upkeep for some of those older buildings. So I do think it's time to take a holistic look across all D65 and figure out where there is an opportunity to really make sure that we're using our existing schools well. And again, that I think would probably involve a combination of thinking about the physical state of those buildings, so which schools are a little bit newer relative, which schools may need less maintenance cost right now. How are these schools dispersed? So kind of what's the location of these schools with respect to serving the greatest number of students? That can help with then right-sizing the classroom. So I do think that the closing of schools is likely to happen, but I think it's important that that's a holistic process. I also think we need to look at that decision in the context of improving the overall academic cultures of the school. So along with cutting some of the central administration staffing, I think that closing buildings gives us an opportunity to have more consistent class sizes, a smaller physical plant to manage, which does allow us to focus a little bit more on the core academic mission. And again, that's in terms of making sure that the resources that we do have, which are obviously more limited now, making sure that those resources are having the maximum impact when we're looking at student outcomes.
And how would you want to include the community in that conversation?
They have to be part of the process. I think there's no doubt. I think that while the past year or so has been difficult as the budget crisis has come to light, it has motivated the community to get more involved in the schools. So certainly the forums that I've been to, the budget reduction meetings, these have taken place at all times of day, sometimes rainy Thursday evenings, early Wednesday morning, and the attendance has been pretty impressive. So I do think that the community is mobilized now, and we have to be really structured and systematic about how we get that feedback. It's one thing to talk about community feedback and collaboration, but we really need to be incredibly intentional about how do we actually do that. Let's put together a calendar and figure out, and a roadmap and figure out when are we connecting with key stakeholders, how are we communicating that, what are the best ways to reach people, are we not just relying on parents and community members and residents to show up to board meetings, are we going into local coffee shops, are we hosting forums at local businesses? Are we going at a variety of different times so that we are getting as much rich feedback as possible? Having a market research background, again, I sort of put on that hat and think about how do we get the best data possible and the best feedback possible so that we're really uncovering as many kind of preferences as possible, and we're really involving the community. Change is always hard, but it's definitely more doable when people feel that they are part of the process from the beginning, and you clearly communicate, here are the criteria and here are the expectations and here is the timeline. So I think part of that includes, as early as possible, establishing what the criteria are for closing schools. I think that's something that we've struggled with a little bit, is what exactly are the objective measures or the criteria that we use, whether we're building a new school or closing an existing school. I think that's been a little bit fuzzy. So I think that establishing, we're going to be looking at, whatever the factors may be, whatever the inputs may be, perhaps it's enrollment capacity, perhaps it's demographics, perhaps it's housing density. There are a number of different criteria that we could include, but that has to be objective criteria and it has to be established at the beginning of the process so that as we start to analyze and evaluate our schools, they're running through a consistent process and a consistent evaluation. So when we arrive at the end of that, there aren't too many surprises. And I think sharing the insights that the board is gathering as we're going through that process will also be important, and not treating this as kind of a closed system where we get a bunch of input, we go into a room, we make a decision, and then we communicate the results. We have to, again, get really creative about how are we connecting and engaging with people.
Moving to academics here, one of the things that we've seen is that we've rebounded a little bit in terms of student achievement from a pandemic low a few years ago. But when we look at the overarching 2 decades, achievement has been relatively stagnant, and especially we've seen a continued struggle with disparate outcomes based on things like race, socioeconomic status, ability. And so what programs specifically do you see as working in the classroom to improve student achievement and experience? And what do you think isn't working?
Sure. Well, I'll just echo what you said, because I think that's a really important point, that the current academic performance, those declines did not start with the pandemic. Particularly when I go back through the data, 2015 to 2018 looks like a really crucial period where we started to see, particularly at the middle school level, drops in ELA and math testing of about 1/3. So when we're talking about the percentage of students who met state expectations on those exams, we're talking about pretty massive declines 2 or 3 years before the pandemic actually struck. So I agree that there's a longer term decline that we need to wrap our arms around. And I would put that into, I think, a couple different buckets before getting to closing the opportunity gap. I think we have seen a little bit of resilience in the elementary school level, particularly post-pandemic. Middle school is a different story. There's really a sort of an unavoidable and pretty large drop off between 5th grade and 8th grade. So something is happening in those middle school years, and we're also seeing much larger and more dramatic declines in math. So something is happening in terms of math education. So I think it's important to kind of wrap our arms around those 2 specific issues. Certainly verify that those are the issues that I'm seeing because I have access to outside data. I want to know what's happening in terms of evaluation data and performance data inside of the schools. But from what I can see, there's definitely a problem once we get to the middle school, or an exacerbated problem once we get to the middle school and math education in general. I think as far as the opportunity gap, we have best practices on what tends to work. So if we look at school systems across the country, things like culturally relevant curricula, personalized learning, project-based learning, there are things that we know that work really well. I think one of the questions that I have that I would like to dig in more into with fellow board members and with the school district as a whole is, to what extent are the teachers being empowered to actually follow those best practices? I think when you have an administration, a central administration that was the size of D65s, that could be a clue that what a lot of teachers were doing was managing to central administration expectations rather than actually managing to the classroom experience. So that's why I'm hopeful with a slightly smaller, potentially more nimble school system, teachers will be able to use some of those best practices when it comes to closing the opportunity gap. Again, I'm not an educator and I'm not a policy expert, but when I talk to teachers, my understanding is they feel like there are some things that really work, but it's been difficult to apply those, particularly within some of the uncertainty that they've been dealing with. When you have issues like a budget crisis, that obviously creeps in to the classroom experience. When you have payment issues and issues getting your paycheck, that's obviously going to kind of seep into your overall effectiveness as a staff member or as an educator. So I'm hopeful that a more stable school system will lead to teachers being able to really do what they do best.
Another topic about the classroom and curriculum that I want to talk about is technology. So technology came up time and again at community meetings about the budget over these last couple of months, and I heard parent concerns about things like iPads in kindergarten. So what do you think the district's technology policy should be? And is there a cutoff for usage that you see in terms of age, anything like that?
The role of technology in K through 8 is probably the question I get the most, or the concern that I get the most in talking to parents about running for school board. And it's the one that comes up most spontaneously too. So if I'm talking to a parent and explaining to them that I'm running, usually one of the first things that they ask unprompted is, what can the board do about the way that education is used across the district? So I think that there's no doubt that we have to really audit the use of technology and figure out how we want to use it most effectively. It's really hard for me to see a case for iPads in the classroom or computers in the classroom lower than third grade. And beyond that, I definitely think we have to be very strategic in the guidance that we provide and in the expectations. I think there's a big difference between having a student go on to IXL to do some additional math problems versus a student being given access to YouTube. So I think we have to be really clear about both the age limits, but also the appropriate use of technology, when it's valuable and when it's not. I think even at the middle school level, I have a lot of concerns as the parent of a middle school parent, as the parent of a middle school student. Middle schoolers are on technology a lot. They're on screens all day long. It's really hard for me to believe that we want more screen time in general in school. To me, that's an opportunity to be a little bit more analog. So I would like to see schools have, in general, a more skeptical approach toward the value of technology. Again, kids are generally awash in screens. I don't think that that is necessarily the best use of our typical learning time.
And do you see a difference in the usage of technology devices in the classroom versus outside the classroom? You know, whether you're, let's say, outside the classroom and how it's used for things like, you know, socially, emotionally, connecting, extracurricularly, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. And I think it's important that there are grassroots organizations that are starting to crop up too, that are addressing some of those questions around what is socially and emotionally appropriate for, say, early teenagers. So there is the Wait Until 8 movement right now, or idea right now in Evanston, which I think is really important. But I do agree that certainly, again, as the parent of a 12-year-old, a device does provide a lot of connection. And it's a way for preteens to start to gain a little bit of independence, to start to learn how to communicate appropriately in an electronic medium. So I do think that devices can have a role in a kid's life. I'm just skeptical about how much value they provide inside of the actual classroom or inside of the school building.
And last question here, certainly not least though, why do you want to be a board member?
So I've thought about public service for a long time. I was a political science major in college. and was looking for the right opportunity over the years. And then once the issues with the D65 board came up, decided that it was the right moment. It combined, I think, some particular skills that I have with an interest in education. My mom was a public education teacher. So it was a combination of I thought, an opportunity to make a difference with my skill set and get involved in public service.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.